The air here carries weight, not the heavy kind that presses, but the kind that balances. You are standing in a garden at the edge of evening, where the last light falls evenly across everything, touching no single thing more than another. The cypress trees stand perfectly still. Somewhere ahead, a pair of scales turn slowly on a thread of silver, though there is no wind. The ground beneath your feet is cool stone, worn smooth by many years of careful steps. There is the faint smell of earth and dried leaves. A fig tree grows at the far end of the path, its branches low, its fruit the colour of dusk. You can hear, very faintly, the sound of two women walking together somewhere ahead of you, their robes brushing the grass without sound, their voices too low to make out. One of them walks with her eyes turned toward the ground, the other looks straight ahead. Neither hurries, neither slows. They have walked like this through many ages of the world. This evening will be among their last together in a place where mortals can still see them, if mortals choose to look. The one who looks ahead will leave a world behind that does not yet know it has lost her. Her name is Nemesis. She is tall and unhurried, and her steps fall with a precision that is not coldness but exactness. Beside her walks Aidos, whose name means shame and modesty, and the quiet knowledge of what one ought not to do. They have always moved together through the world of men and women. Where Nemesis measures what is owed, Aidos offers the inner voice that might prevent the debt from forming at all. Two sisters not of blood but of purpose, paired from the beginning of things. In the long light of a declining age, they walk among mortals for what may be the last time. The world they move through is not yet ruined. There are still children who tend to their father's fields. There are still women who pour water for strangers without being asked. There are still priests who remember the words of the offerings and mean them. But at the edges of things, something has shifted. A king in a distant city has claimed more land than his harvest warrants. A man of middle fortune has built a house that sits too tall above his neighbours. A soldier returning from a small and unnecessary war speaks of his own courage as though he invented the concept. These are not large transgressions, they are small ones. But small ones, allowed to multiply, become the texture of an age. Nemesis notices each one. Not with anger. Anger is not her nature. She notices the way a woman notices a scale beginning to tip, the barely visible tremor of imbalance, the slight deviation from what the order of things requires. She carries a measuring rod of pale wood. She has carried it since the beginning. It is not for punishment. It is for precision. She uses it the way a mason uses a level, not to harm the stone, but to know the truth of where it sits. Aidos walks close at her side. She is softer in appearance, her head often bent, her eyes cast down, not in submission but in attention. She watches the faces of mortals when they are about to do something they know is wrong. She is the slight hesitation before the unkind word, the pause before the greedy hand reaches out. She does not always succeed in stopping what she witnesses, but she is there. She has been there since men first learned to want more than their portion. Between the two of them, they have kept something alive in the world for a very long time. Something difficult to name precisely. The sense, known without being stated, that there is a measure to things. That fortune can be deserved and undeserved. That an excess in one place must find its answer somewhere else. That a man who builds himself too high will feel, eventually, the correction of level ground. This evening they have stopped at the edge of a road that runs between two villages. There was a dispute here this afternoon, though neither Nemesis nor Aidos was the cause of it. A merchant passed through and sold a weight of grain at a measure that was slightly less than he named it. The buyer noticed too late. The merchant is already gone. Nemesis crouches at the side of the road. She presses one hand flat against the dust. She is still for a long moment. Aidos watches her. Nemesis rises. She says nothing. but somewhere across several hills the merchant's axle will crack before he reaches the next town, not violently, not tragically, simply enough that he will have to stop and wait and spend the night in discomfort and think. This is how she works, not with thunder. Not with the grand gesture that ends in ruin. Most of her corrections are small, precise, and invisible to everyone except the one who needed them. Aidos takes her arm as they continue walking. Neither of them speaks for a time. The light is lower now. The first stars are beginning to show above the horizon, faint and certain. The Silver Age is ending. Nemesis has watched the ages turn before. She has seen mortals at their finest, careful and restrained, grateful for what the earth gave them without grasping at more. She has seen them change. The Iron Age is close. She can feel it the way a person feels weather before it arrives, a change in the pressure of the air, a heaviness where there was lightness before. Aidos speaks quietly. She says that she does not think she can stay much longer in a world where no one feels her presence. A warning unheard is only silence. A check with no purchase holds nothing back. Nemesis does not answer immediately. She watches a young man pass along a path on the hill above them. He does not see them. He is carrying something under his arm and moving with a satisfaction that edges, just barely, past what his errand warrants. She watches him until he is gone. Then she says simply that she will stay a little while yet. The scales on their silver thread, somewhere behind them in the garden of the evening, continue their slow turning. Not settling, not swinging, simply moving through the space between one balance and the next, the way all things do in the long, patient work of the world finding its own level. If you find this kind of slow, mythological storytelling useful for sleep, a like or a subscription helps the channel continue. She was born before the world had a name for what she was. Nyx came first. Night herself. Not darkness as mortals understand it, the simple absence of light between one day and the next. No, Nyx was something older. She was the deep, original dark from which all ordering things eventually emerged. She moved through the cosmos with a gravity that even Zeus was careful around. She had no need of throne or palace. She was her own country. From Nyx came many children. The Fates, who measured the thread of mortal lives without sentiment. Sleep, who walked among men each evening and was never thanked for it. Death, quiet and without malice. Strife. Old Age. The Hesperides, who tended the golden apple trees at the rim of the world. And Nemesis. She came from Nyx, the way precision comes from darkness. The way a clear line emerges when light first touches an edge. She was not born crying. She was not born uncertain. She arrived with the measuring rod already in her understanding, the way a plumb line knows what vertical means before it has ever been tested against a wall. Erebus, the deep darkness beneath the earth, is named by some as her father. Others say she sprang from Nyx alone, needing no second source. This disagreement does not trouble Nemesis. Origin is not what she is concerned with. She is concerned with what follows from it. She was given her charge at the beginning of things. The word that names her comes from a verb meaning to give what is due, to distribute, to portion out. Not punishment in the furious sense, not revenge taken in the heat of an insult. Distribution. The careful, impersonal act of returning things to their correct measure. She carried from the beginning 4 tools. The measuring rod. Pale wood, smooth from long use. It has touched the brow of kings and the hands of farmers with equal indifference. It does not care who it measures. It only returns the truth. The scales. 2 pans on a silver thread, neither heavier than the other when empty. She has never seen a mortal life that did not eventually register on them. Some tip slowly. Some tip fast. All of them tip. The bridle, not for horses, though it can look like one. It is for what runs too fast, for ambition that outstrips the course it was given, for pride that has broken free of the stable and is moving across open ground with no thought of stopping. The bridle does not break the horse. It reminds it that it was ever tethered, and the whip, not used often, used precisely. It is not for causing suffering, it is for closing the distance between what a person has done and what they know they have done. There are moments when the correction must be felt rather than simply known. The whip is for those moments. With these 4 things she has been working since before the great ages had their names. The gods of Olympus had their own instruments. Zeus held his thunderbolt and dispensed his version of justice, which was sometimes accurate and sometimes complicated by his own preferences. Athena offered wisdom. Apollo gave prophecy. These were real gifts. They shaped the world in necessary ways, but Nemesis worked in a different register. She did not sit in council on Olympus. She did not receive prayers in marble temples, at least not in those early ages. She moved through the world as the world required her, attending to the places where even divine law could not reach, the interior dispositions of men. The private calculations of who deserves what, the slow creep of surplus on one side of a ledger and deficit on the other. She is not a punisher in the common sense. A punisher requires anger, requires the sense that something has been done to them personally. Nemesis has never been personally insulted. She cannot be. She is not the object of any man's ambition or greed. She is simply the mechanism by which ambition and greed are answered. This is what made her unlike the other children of Nyx. Her siblings could be avoided, petitioned, delayed. Sleep could be held off. Strife could sometimes be sidestepped. Even death, in the great myths, was occasionally outwitted for a time. Narcissus would discover this. But Nemesis was not approached. She approached. She did not wait to be invited into a situation. She read the imbalance in the air, the way a musician hears when something is slightly out of tune, before anyone else notices, before the note has fully resolved into sound, and she moved. The name Adrastea was sometimes given to her, the inescapable one. It is an honest name, not a threat. Simply a description of how the mechanism works. There is no running from a correction. There is only the correction arriving in its own time, at its own scale, through whatever door happens to be available. In those early ages she walked the earth openly. Mortals in the Golden Age had no need of her. They took what they were given. They did not build their houses too tall. They did not weigh grain lightly. They were grateful in the old way, the way that does not require being told to be grateful, but even then she walked. She was present as a guarantee, the way a level set on a shelf is not measuring anything particular but is ready. The fact of her being there kept certain possibilities closed. When the Silver Age came, she began to work more steadily. Now, on this evening, that is her last evening, clearly visible among living things, she understands something she has understood for a long time without needing to say it. The Iron Age will not end her. It will change how she works. She will become less visible, more structural, woven into the grain of consequence rather than moving as a recognizable figure along a road. She will be felt rather than seen. A reign cut short before its arrogance fully flowered. A fortune that diminishes in the season after it became excessive. A man who built himself too high finding one quiet morning that the height no longer holds. She will still be there. She has always been there. From the moment Nyx breathed the first dark into form, and Nemesis opened her eyes in it, measuring the distances, she has been there. Aidos walks beside her now in the last of the declining light. Neither of them moves toward the road again. They stand for a moment near the old cypress tree. The faint smell of dried leaves, the cool stone beneath them, worn smooth over long use. The scales on their silver thread move slowly. one pan and then the other. Patient, unhurried. The first stars are very clear now above the dark ridge of the hills. Aidos did not speak. She rarely did at this hour. Her silence was its own form of communication. The same quality of silence that falls over a room when someone has just understood something important and has chosen not to announce it. Nemesis stood beside her a little longer. The cypress moved faintly. The dried leaves shifted and settled. Then she moved on. Not away from Aidos, simply forward. The way water moves when the ground tilts slightly and there is somewhere lower to go. Aidos followed without being asked. This was how they had always walked together, one moving, one attending. The road below the ridge was empty now. The last of the day's travellers had found their shelter before darkness came. Smoke rose from a settlement further along the valley. Thin, pale smoke, the kind that comes from a fire that has been built slowly and with attention. Someone down there had gathered wood with care, had measured how much they would need, had not taken more. Nemesis noted this. She noted most things. Not with approval exactly, but with the quiet recognition that balance, when it occurs naturally, requires nothing from her. She could move past. She moved past. Further along the valley was a different matter. She had been watching a particular king for some seasons now. His name was not remarkable. His lineage was not unusual. He had been given a good land, well watered, with grain that grew without much difficulty, and hills that stopped the worst of the winter winds. He had a city of moderate size, loyal enough, fed well enough. He had been given his portion. And then he had begun to take more, not through war, not at first. Through the slower methods, grain weighed on scales that had been adjusted by a hand's width. Land boundaries marked with stones that moved in the night, tax records that recorded less than was given and more than was owed. Each adjustment was small. Each one alone might have looked like error. But Nemesis did not read individual transactions. She read the whole ledger. And the ledger of this king had grown, over 3 seasons, past the point where error was a sufficient explanation. She did not move toward his city now. She moved toward the road that ran beside the river near the edge of his territory. There was a merchant there, one she had watched for 2 days. He carried grain across the border, and the grain he carried had been weighed out short twice, not once. Twice. She stopped beside the river. The water was dark and quiet in the evening. She could hear it moving over the stones. The measuring rod in her hand, pale wood, smooth from long use, caught the last light from the west and held it for a moment. The merchant's fire was visible from where she stood. He had made camp on the far bank. He was comfortable. He ate without hesitation. He slept, she knew, without difficulty. The men who carry out small injustices on behalf of larger ones rarely feel the full mass of what they carry. That comes later. When the mechanism closes. She did not cross the river that night. She was not always arriving. She was often observing, taking account, letting the ledger fill to the point where the correction, when it came, would be exact. Not larger than necessary, not smaller. Precise. This was the part that living things rarely understood. They imagined correction as something that came when the wrongdoing reached a certain loudness, a certain drama, a kind of crescendo that demanded response. But Nemesis did not work by loudness. She worked by measurement. The scale tipped not when the offence became visible, but when the weight became genuinely unequal. Some offences were loud and tipped quickly. Some were quiet and tipped over long seasons. The river moved past both kinds at the same unhurried pace. She turned from the water and walked back along the ridge. Aidos was waiting near a fig tree at the top of the slope. The tree was old. Its roots had broken through the surface of the earth and lay exposed, pale in the failing light. Aidos leaned against its trunk, not resting exactly, but settled. the way figures settle who have been walking for longer than any single age can measure. The smell of the valley came up on the night air. Dry grass, the faint sweetness of the fig leaves, something mineral from the river, cold stone brought up on moving water. Nemesis stood beside her companion and looked out across the valley. The king's city was invisible in the dark, only a few lights. The faint suggestion of walls. Somewhere in there a man slept in rooms built from surplus he had not earned. His dreams probably were quiet. The unsettled feeling would come in increments. A harvest slightly below expectation, a trade route shifting, a daughter's marriage falling through in ways that could not quite be attributed to any single cause. The correction would not announce itself. It would arrive through ordinary doors. This is how most corrections arrived. Not as lightning, not as flood, as a series of small closures, one door after another, gently and firmly shut. She did not feel satisfaction at this. Satisfaction belongs to beings who want outcomes. Nemesis did not want outcomes. She enacted them. The weigher scale does not want to be level, but cannot help being level when the weights are equal. A moth moved past her in the dark, pale and without direction, drifting on air that was barely moving. Above the dark ridge, the stars were fully present now. Not emerging. Simply there, clear and very distant in the deep blue that comes after all the light has fully gone. The kind of sky that has no transition left in it, only the settled dark and what burns in it. Aidos shifted slightly beside the fig tree. Nemesis looked north along the ridge. Somewhere far in that direction, a man was about to make a decision he had been building toward for months. He did not know yet that the decision had already been registered in the way that all imbalances are registered before the act, in the disposition, in the long, slow lean of a life away from what it was given. She would be there when he arrived at the moment. She would not need to hurry. She never needed to hurry. The scales on their silver thread moved, almost imperceptibly, in the night air. One pan, then the other, finding their level, patient, in the way that only very old things can be patient, not waiting for something, but simply continuing. The moth was gone. The valley was still. The river moved over its stones below in the dark, making the small sound of water that had somewhere to go. The night had fully settled. No softening at the horizon. No last pink line above the hills. Only the dark and the stars in it, and the two figures standing near the old fig tree at the top of the ridge. Nemesis did not speak for a long time. Neither did Aidos. This was not unusual. They had walked together through ages that had no names yet, and they had learned, or perhaps simply become, the kind of presence that does not need to fill silence with sound. The breeze moved through the cypress trees below. Faint, barely a rustle. The smell of dry grass came with it, and the cold mineral trace of the river, and underneath all of it the fig leaves, faintly sweet. Then something changed. Not in the valley, not in the king's city, which was still invisible in the dark, its few lights steady and small. Not in the merchant's camp on the far bank, where the fire had burned lower but still held. The change was elsewhere. High and far, in the texture of the night itself. Nemesis felt it before she understood it. A pressure. Not from below, from above. She looked up. The stars were unchanged. They burned at their ordinary distances, patient and cold. But behind them, or perhaps woven into the space between them, she felt a presence that was not the dark, and was not the light, and was not anything she had placed there herself. Aidos stood straighter, slightly, almost imperceptibly, the way figures stand when they sense something approaching that has not yet announced itself. Nemesis lowered her gaze. She had felt this before. Not often, not with any regularity. But she knew what it was. Zeus moved through the heavens in ways that were not always thunder and not always visible. Sometimes his attention was simply present, the way a large stone becomes present in a room, even in darkness, by the weight it displaces in the air around it. She held the measuring rod at her side. Her hand did not tighten on it. She was not afraid. But she was alert. This was new. Or rather, it was the beginning of something new. She did not yet know its shape. She had moved through the mortal world for a long time in a kind of ordered quiet, observing, recording, enacting corrections that came as small closures through ordinary doors. She had not been pursued. She had not needed to be anything other than what she was, a force that moves as measurement moves, without desire, without agenda, without complication. What she felt now had the quality of complication. Aidos was watching her. Nemesis did not look at her companion. She looked north along the ridge, where the hills fell away into flatness, and the flatness became coast, and the coast became the sea. She could not see the sea from here. But she knew where it was. She always knew where water was. The pressure above intensified for a moment, then eased. Then was simply present, the way it would remain, she understood, from this point forward. This was the difficulty. Not the king who had taken more than his portion, not the merchant with his short weights. Those were her work, and her work was clear to her. The difficulty was this. What arrives when the force that measures things becomes itself the object of desire? She could not measure desire. That was not her function. Desire had no counterweight she could place on the other pan. It was not hubris exactly, though it wore hubris sometimes like a borrowed garment. It was not injustice exactly, though it could produce injustice the way wind produces waves, not being the same thing as the water, but moving through it entirely. She knew what it was. And she knew, in the way she always knew things, that it would not stop. The scales on their silver thread moved at her side. One pan, then the other. Back, they found no level. That was notable. In all the long work of her existence, the scales had always found their level eventually. Even slowly, even after many seasons. They had always come to rest. They did not come to rest now. Aidos moved away from the fig tree. She came to stand beside Nemesis, not speaking, not touching, simply present, the way she was always present. One moves, one attends. Below, the river made its small sound over stones. Nemesis looked at the scales. The pans were moving more than the breeze could explain. Something was out of balance in the larger order, not in the valley, not in the merchant's ledger, not in the king's slow ruin. Something further back, in the structure itself. She did not have a word for what she felt. Feelings were not her primary instrument. But there was something she might have called unease if pressed, though it sat inside her more quietly than that word suggests, a kind of open question, suspended in the air the way the scales were suspended, unanswered. She thought of her mother. Nyx moved through the sky above even now. The darkness through which the stars burned was not empty. It had a presence. Her mother's presence, old and cool and entirely without concern for what moved within it. Nyx had made her this way, precise, without appetite, the correcting force given form. That was the gift and the nature and the limitation, all three in the same thing. What she had just felt, pressing from above, was not without appetite. The cypress trees moved in the valley below. The breeze came through them and reached the ridge and passed. The fig tree behind her creaked once, very faintly, its old roots holding in the dry ground. Nemesis stood still. She did not yet move. She did not run from things she had not yet seen clearly. She did not make adjustments before she understood what required adjusting. These were her rules. Not rules she had chosen, rules she was made of. But she was aware, with the particular awareness of a force that has never before needed to account for its own position in the balance, that something was coming that her scales could not measure. and that this mattered. The river moved below in the dark. The merchant's fire on the far bank held its small light. Somewhere to the north, the man who had been building toward a decision was still building. He had not arrived yet. Nemesis would be there when he did. She always arrived. But the presence in the sky above the ridge had not withdrawn. It rested there, patient in its own way, which was nothing like her patience. Her patience was the patience of measurement, of waiting for the weight to become genuinely unequal. This other patience had a different quality. It would wait, she understood, but not indefinitely. And it was not measuring anything. The scales settled at last, one pan slightly lower than the other, resting in the imbalance, not finding level. Aidos was quiet beside her. The fig tree held its roots in the dark earth. The stars burned in the deep blue above them, very distant, each one exactly where it had always been. The origin she carried was not a story she had been told. It was what she was made of. Standing on the ridge in the dark, with the scales resting in their small imbalance at her side, Nemesis let her attention move backward. Not to the king, not to the merchant's fire on the far bank below. Further back than all of that, to the beginning of her, which was also the beginning of many things. There had been no light when Nyx brought her into existence. That was appropriate. Light was a later development, a refinement. What came first was the dark, and what came out of the dark were the forces that would eventually make light meaningful. Nyx moved without sound. She had always moved without sound. The night sky above the ridge was her passage, and the stars were not her children but the punctures through which other light pressed. Cold and distant, doing nothing to reduce the dark that surrounded them. From Nyx had come many things. This was simply what Nyx did. She produced from herself the necessary forces. Thanatos, the quiet end of things. Hypnos, his brother, softer and more regular. The Moirai, who measured thread in a different way than Nemesis measured weight, though the purpose was related. Apete, who was deception. Oises, who was distress. They were siblings of a kind, though kind was perhaps the wrong word. They were co-productions, siblings in the way that the dark and the cold are siblings. Not chosen, simply arriving together. Nemesis had arrived the same way. She remembered it, the way you remember something that was never an event, only a condition. There had been no birth in the mortal sense, no particular moment. Only the gradual gathering of a function into a form. Nyx had held within herself the principle of correction. The universe had certain properties. Things that rose too high would eventually find resistance. Things that accumulated without limit would eventually encounter a counterforce. This was not cruelty. It was structure. Nemesis was that structure. Given hands, she had arrived with the measuring rod already part of her. The scales had come into existence at the same time. She had, the same way a river arrives with its current. You could not separate them. The silver thread from which they hung was not something she had been given. It was an extension of what she was. From Nyx she had also received a kind of attention, a way of noticing. Nyx noticed everything that passed through her, every mortal who slept. Every soul that moved into darkness. She did not intervene. She simply held it all within her vast and unhurried awareness. Nemesis had inherited that attention, narrowed it, made it functional. Her mother saw everything and acted on nothing. She saw the specific things that required response and responded. That was the difference between them, and it was, she understood, the origin of her purpose. The Moirai had come out of Nyx at a similar time. She had some memory of them from that early period, if memory was even the right word. Clotho with her spindle, Lachesis measuring the thread, Atropos with the shears, waiting. They did not speak either, not in those early ages. There was nothing yet to say. The work had not yet begun because the mortals had not yet arrived, and the mortals were whom the work was for. She and the Moirai had understood each other without needing to communicate. Their functions were related but distinct. The fates worked forward. They spun what was coming. She worked in correction. She addressed what had gone wrong. The fates set the measure. She enforced it when it was violated. Neither could do the other's work, and neither tried. Aidos had come later, or perhaps at the same time. Nemesis did not have certainty about the sequence. What she knew was that Aidos was not from Nyx. She was from a different arrangement of early things. Yet they had found each other because their functions drew them together. Where shame must walk, retribution eventually follows. Where retribution works, shame often arrives first to prepare the ground. They had walked together for a very long time. An owl called from somewhere below the ridge. A single note. Then silence. The sound moved through the dark air and dissolved. Nemesis registered it without turning her head. The owl was working. Alert in the darkness. Patient in a way that required no explanation. She looked at the scales, one pan still lower. The imbalance was not increasing, but it was not resolving. She thought about the long work that lay between that origin and this ridge, the king she had visited across many generations, the men who had gathered too much into their own hands and felt, eventually, the counter-pressure she represented. They had not always understood what was happening to them. Some of them never understood. They thought it was misfortune, bad luck, the caprice of gods who had turned against them without reason. That was never how it worked. She had never arrived without reason. She had never arrived before the balance demanded it. She was not interested in suffering. She was interested in correction. There was a difference, though mortals sometimes failed to see it. The rod at her side was cool against her hand, smooth. Heavy in its particular way, not heavy like stone, but dense with meaning. When she carried it into the presence of someone who had exceeded their proper measure, they sometimes looked at it without understanding what it was. That was all right. They did not need to understand the instrument. They only needed to receive its finding. The merchant's fire below had reduced further, a soft, low glow across the water. The river continued its sound over stones. The cypress trees were still now, the breeze having passed some time ago. Aidos stood beside her, not moving, her presence steady and unremarkable, the way it always was. One watches. One attends. Above the ridge, the weight in the sky had not moved. Nemesis became aware, very slowly, of what the combination meant. Her origin had made her for one kind of work, the work of correction, the work of response. She was built for acting upon the world, not for being acted upon. Every function she had been given, every attribute she carried, was oriented outward. What pressed from above was oriented toward her. She had no instrument for this. No rod whose length could measure it, no pan on which to place it and watch the balance tip or hold. The owl called once more from the dark below, closer this time, or perhaps the same distance, the night having grown more still around it. Nemesis looked at the stars above, each one burning in its fixed position, patient, distant, entirely indifferent to what occurred beneath them. Her mother's darkness held them all. The weight above the ridge had no name she could apply to it. That was the first difficulty. She had names for most things. The names were not words exactly, not the kind mortals arranged into speech, but they were recognizable. The names of imbalance, the names of excess, the names of pride gathered too thick in one person's hands. She knew all of those. She had known them from the beginning of her work. This had a different quality. Not the name of something wrong, the name of something coming. She stood on the ridge with the measuring rod at her side and let the awareness settle. Below, the merchant's fire had reduced to coals now, a faint orange eye across the water. The river kept moving, Stones turned nothing over and nothing was turned. Just water and its low, continuous sound. Then the pressure shifted. It was not dramatic. Nothing in the sky opened. No thunder arrived, but the weight that had been pressing downward began to move, not vertically now, but horizontally, spreading across the ridge, along the high places where the air was cold and the cypress trees stood without moving. Aidos made no sound. She was rarely the one who named things first. Nemesis understood, with the same quiet certainty that had oriented her since the beginning, that the pursuit had started. Not here, not yet. But it had started somewhere in the vast arrangement of the world. Someone had turned toward her. And it was not a mortal. She did not move immediately. She stood on the ridge with the scales hanging beside her, one pan still lower, the imbalance patient and unresolved. She let the knowledge settle into her the way water settles into stone. Slowly, without force. Then she stepped from the ridge. She did not fly. Flight was not her first nature. She moved the way correction moves, steadily, without hurry, but without pause. The high ground gave way to lower ground. The air changed as she descended toward a coast she had not visited in some time. The sea reached her before she could see it, salt and depth and the constant restlessness that water keeps. She reached the shoreline before dawn. The beach was pale stone and dark sand, narrow, pressed between cliffs and the waterline. A single boat pulled up above the tide, its hull dark with tar and age. No fisherman yet. No sound from any human structure. Only the sea running itself forward and back across the stones. She stood at the water's edge and felt the pursuit arrive behind her. Not Zeus himself, not yet his form, but his intent. Large and unmistakable, filling the air around her the way weather fills a valley before the storm is visible, she stepped into the water. It was cold. Even for her, even without human flesh to register cold in the way mortals register it, the sea had a particular quality of opposition. It pushed back. It asked, in its way, whether she was certain. She was certain. She moved into the water until it rose around her, and then she changed. The change was not painful. It was more like finding a fact that had always been true. She had always been capable of this. The capacity had simply been waiting for the occasion to make itself known. Her form dissolved into scaled silver length, a fish, small enough to lose against the current. Her eye moved to the side of her head, and the sea became a different medium entirely. Dark below, lit above, crossed by the shadows of waves. She felt him enter the water behind her. He was also a fish, larger, moving with a kind of determined ease that she recognized as power, not entirely certain of itself. He was fast. She changed direction without warning, feeling the current shift as she cut across it and put distance between them. The sea held them both without preference. She moved through it for a long time. The light above the water shifted as the sun travelled across a sky she could not see from beneath. She became a serpent in deeper water, slow-moving and cold, coiling along the sandy bottom where the light barely reached. She felt him become something longer behind her, something that moved the same way. She did not look back. She rose toward shallower water. On land she was a lion briefly. The change arrived, the way the fish had arrived, from within, as if the form had always been resident and needed only release. She was heavy and warm, her paws wide on a flat stone above the waterline, the morning air filling her with the smell of salt and dried grass. The coast was different here. She had crossed distance in the water. A stand of pines stood back from the shore. Beyond them, a shepherd's herd still sleeping in the early cold grey shapes against greyer ground. He arrived as a lion too. Of course. She could hear his breath now, in this form, where air was everything and hearing was low and broad. She did not wait. She moved into the pines without sound. Through the trees and beyond them, the land flattened into marsh. Reed grass stood tall in still water. Frogs calling somewhere distant. The air smelled of mud and standing water, and something faintly sweet from reeds warmed by whatever sun had crept above the horizon. Here, at the marsh's edge, she took the final form, a goose. Grey-white, still standing at the waterline with her feet in the shallow cold, the marsh spread before her, unhurried, the reeds reflecting themselves in water that barely moved. She heard him settle behind her, a swan. White, large, moving through the shallow water without sound, she did not run. There was nowhere left to run that would not be followed. She understood this. She had understood it since the ridge, since the pressure first arrived from above, the scales hanging from their silver thread with one pan lower. The imbalance required something of her. She was still. The marsh water reflected the pale sky above it. Somewhere in the reeds a single bird called once and was silent. The shepherd's flock remained out of sight beyond the pines. The morning continued without urgency around them, grey and cold and soft. The swan moved through the water without urgency. Nemesis felt him approach the way one feels a change in pressure. Not threatening exactly, not gentle either. Something between the two that had no name in any language she knew. She held her form. Grey-white feathers, feet planted in the cold mud, the marsh spreading around her in its quiet morning grey. The reeds stood in rows that the light barely touched. The water between them was dark and still. He came alongside her. The swan was large, white as quarried stone, and it moved with the particular ease of something that had ceased to hurry because it had already arrived. She could feel the displacement of water as he settled near. She could feel the warmth that radiated from him even across that small distance. She did not move away. There was nothing left to move toward. She had crossed the sea in silver and shadow. She had coiled along the sandy bottom where the light did not reach. She had moved through the pines without sound and crossed the flat land into marsh. Each form had carried her a little farther and closed the distance a little less than the one before it. The shapes she could become were not infinite. They were many, but not infinite. The marsh accepted them both. That was the nature of such places. Water and land in equal measure, committed to neither. He did not speak. She would not have expected him to. The forms they wore did not carry language. They carried weight and warmth and the fact of proximity. That was enough for what the morning required. She understood what was happening. She had understood it from the moment the scales tipped. The pan had dropped and could not be righted by distance or change of shape or the cold of deeper water. Something was owed to the order she herself upheld. She had carried the measuring rod long enough to know when a correction moved through her rather than from her. This was that. The marsh water did not reflect them clearly. The surface was too dark, too broken by the faint breath of morning air across the reeds. What moved above the water and what lay below were two separate things, only loosely related. She was still. And in the stillness, the thing that was required of her occurred, not with force, not with announcement. The way water finds the low ground it was always going to find. Quiet and specific, and without the drama that mortals later imagined for it. The grey light held steady above the reeds. The frogs somewhere in the distant water continued their low calling and then stopped, as if something had passed overhead too high to see. The shepherd's flock beyond the pines remained as it had been, grey shapes on grey ground, asleep and undisturbed. Then the swan lifted from the water. He rose in the way of the form he wore, with the broad, slow beat of large wings that pushed the air down and the water into small rings that spread until they reached the reeds and disappeared. He climbed above the marsh, above the pines, above the coast she had crossed in the dark and the early cold. She watched him go. The sky above the marsh was pale and even. He was white against it for a long moment, and then the sky absorbed him, and there was only the sky. She remained at the water's edge. The form she held felt natural still. There was no urgency to change it. The goose was a quiet form. It asked nothing of her except stillness and the patience to stand in shallow water while the cold moved against her feet. She was aware of something new. It was not knowledge, not exactly. It was more like the sensation of carrying something. The pan of the scale had moved again, and in a different direction. The silver thread still held both pans, but the relationship between them was no longer what it had been. Something had shifted in the inner workings of the balance she embodied, not resolved, not closed, only changed. She thought of her mother, Nyx, who had shaped her in the dark before the first light existed, who had handed her the measuring rod and the scales and the understanding of what they meant. Her mother had never told her what the weight would feel like when it moved inside her rather than in the world beyond her. Perhaps Nyx had assumed she would understand when the time came. She understood now. The reeds moved slightly. A breath of wind off the sea, barely strong enough to name. She remained in the water for a time after that. The morning grew slowly brighter without becoming warm. The sun was somewhere behind the clouds that had gathered while she stood still, thin clouds, the kind that do not bring rain but soften everything they cover. The marsh stayed grey. The water stayed dark. The distant frogs began again, one voice and then several, and then silence once more. After a time, she stepped from the water onto the firmer ground that bordered the marsh. She stood on land with the memory of water still cold at her feet and the smell of mud and sweet reed around her. She let herself return to her own form without haste. The change moved through her, the way the previous changes had from the inside outward, finding the shape that was always resident, returning to it. Her hands at her sides, the ground beneath her bare feet, the measuring rod present as it was always present. She looked out over the marsh. The water held the sky in it, pale and even and cold and, in its own way, whole. She stood there and knew that what had occurred in the grey water was not the end of the account being kept. It was an entry in it, a moment recorded in the long ledger she had maintained since before the first mortal drew breath, since before the first king mistook good fortune for deserving, somewhere beyond the pines. A shepherd would wake to the morning cold and move among his flock. He would count them. He would find them whole. He did not yet know what the morning had held in the marsh behind the trees. He did not yet know what would eventually come to him from it, what he would carry, unsuspecting, in his hands. Nemesis did not look toward the pines. She looked at the water, at the reed grass standing in it, at the pale sky, the marsh held without effort, without claim. The scales hung from their silver thread, both pans present. The thread straight, not resolved. Not balanced, not yet, perhaps not for a long time, but changed. She was still. The morning had fully arrived by the time she moved, not warm, not bright, just present, the way a grey morning asserts itself without asking permission. The light sat evenly across the marsh, across the reed grass, across the dark water that still held the outline of the sky. She stood on the firmer ground and felt the cold of the mud drying on her feet. There was an egg. It was not large, not remarkable to look at. Pale, smooth, the colour of old ivory left in a dark room. She looked at it where it lay among the reeds, half hidden in the low grass at the water's edge, and she felt the familiar sensation of something recorded. Something added to the account. The egg was hers. She did not doubt this the way a mortal might doubt it. She simply knew it, the way she knew the position of both pans on the silver thread. The way she knew which mortals somewhere had taken more than their portion of good fortune and had not yet been corrected. She did not touch it. That was not her role here. She had carried it this far, and now it would pass into other hands. That was the nature of what had occurred in the grey water, not an ending. An entry, a beginning of a longer thing. She crouched at the water's edge beside the nest of flattened reed grass and looked at the egg for a time. The cold came up from the ground through her feet and her knees. A single heron moved across the far end of the marsh, low and unhurried, and settled among the reeds without a sound. She thought about what the egg contained. Not the details, not the name of the child, not the particular shape of the life that would unfold from it. She was not that kind of knowing, but she felt the weight of what was inside it. The kind of weight that doesn't sit still, the kind that, once it enters the world and begins to move, disturbs other weights beside it, and others beside those, all the way down a chain too long to trace in a single morning. This would matter. She knew that without needing to know how. The reed grass stirred again. The breath of the sea, faint and persistent. She stood and she waited. The shepherd came through the pines before the light had shifted much. He was not a young man. His cloak was rough wool, the grey of river stone, and he moved with the careful step of someone who had walked this ground many times and knew where the earth was reliable and where it gave way beneath the foot. He was not looking for what he found. He had come to the marsh edge for the same reason he came most mornings when the season was cold. To check the water level, to look for signs of illness in the birds that nested there, to be away from the flock for a few minutes while the animals were still quiet. He saw the egg and stopped. He stood a short distance from it and looked at it the way someone looks at a thing that should not be there. His breath came slowly in the cold air. Then he crouched. He reached out and touched the shell with 2 fingers, testing its warmth, testing whether it was whole. It was warm. It was whole. He looked around the marsh as if expecting to find the bird that had left it, but there was nothing at the water's edge except the reed grass and the still dark water and the heron somewhere out of sight. He sat with it in his hands for a moment. The egg fit naturally in his palms. The way objects do when they have been made for that particular purpose, without anyone ever knowing it. He did not understand what he was holding. He was a practical man. He knew birds. He knew the marsh. He knew the difference between an egg abandoned and an egg simply waiting. This one was neither. It was something he had no category for, so he set it gently in the fold of his cloak and turned back toward the pines. He would find it a place. He would find someone who would know what to do with it. Nemesis watched him go. She had not been visible to him. That was not how she moved in the world, not directly, not standing in open ground to be looked at. She was present in the way that the corrective force of the cosmos is always present, close enough to act, distant enough to go unnoticed. She watched him pass through the pines. His shape moved between the dark trunks and grew smaller, and then was gone. The marsh was quiet again. The flock beyond the trees made a low sound, one animal and then others answering, and then the sound settled back into silence. The shepherd's voice reached her faintly, steady and low, the voice of a man checking that his animals were where they should be. They were. The measuring rod rested along her forearm. Both pans of the scale were present, the thread straight. The relationship between them continuing its slow adjustment in the deep working of things. She thought of the long road ahead for what the shepherd carried. Sparta was south and west. The road was not short. The egg would pass from the shepherd's hands to other hands, and eventually it would come to a woman in a palace by the Eurotas River. A woman with dark eyes and a calm way of standing, and that woman would keep it until it opened. What came out of it would be called the most beautiful woman in the world. Nemesis had no particular feeling about this. Beauty was a kind of weight too. It pressed down on both pans without asking permission. It accumulated interest the way all unearned advantages did. Somewhere in the future of that beauty was a war, a burning, a generation of men crossing black water who would not return. The account would be kept through all of it. The marsh water held the grey sky. The thin clouds moved faintly overhead. Somewhere over the pines a bird she could not see called once, and the sound moved across the reed grass and the dark water and faded. She stood at the edge of the marsh at Ramnus. on the Attic coast, on a cold and ordinary morning, and the ground held her weight, the same way it held the weight of the shepherd's footprints filling slowly with water behind him, she would remember this place. The ground would remember it too, in the way the ground remembers everything that falls on it and is not moved. Time passed at Ramnus the way it always did in winter, without warmth, without hurry. The marsh held its stillness. The reed grass moved when the air moved and was quiet when the air was quiet. The grey light settled across the water and did not change. Nemesis remained a while longer. There was no particular reason to leave before the morning had finished its work. The egg was gone. The shepherd was gone. What remained was the shallow depression in the flattened reeds where the shell had rested, and the faint mark of 2 knees in the soft ground where the old man had crouched. These would fill in by midday. By nightfall nothing would mark the place. She looked at it a moment longer. Then she turned from the marsh and moved through the pines. The road south was a long one. She did not travel it as a woman travels a road, on foot, mile by mile, feeling the cold in the soles of her feet. Distance was not the same thing for her. She was in Ramnus, and then she was not, and the world between those 2 positions continued its ordinary business without noticing her passage through it. Sparta received the egg in the way that Sparta received most things, quietly, without fuss. The palace on the Eurotas River was a practical building, low-walled and plain by the standards of other kingdoms, the stone worn smooth in the corridors where men walked daily. The river was audible from inside it on quiet mornings. Leda kept the egg in a warm room. She did not speak much about where it had come from. She was not a woman who spoke much about things she could not fully explain, and this was a thing she could not fully explain, so she kept it close and kept it warm and waited. Nemesis observed this. She had no particular feeling about Leda either. The woman was practical, as the shepherd had been practical, and she was capable of a steady kind of care that did not require understanding in order to function. She would tend the egg well. She would keep it until it opened. What came out of it was called Helen. She was a small child at first, as all children are, and the beauty was not immediately apparent as anything extraordinary. There was something in the arrangement of her features that was precise in a way other faces were not, the way a well-made object has a precision that reveals itself slowly. But it was not yet the kind of thing that stopped men in the middle of what they were doing. Nemesis watched from a careful distance as the child grew. This was not a thing she had done often. She was not, in her nature, a watcher of children. The work she did was generally the work of adjustment, of correction, of the slow application of weight to the other side of things that had grown too heavy. Children had not yet accumulated the kind of imbalance that required her attention, but Helen was different. Helen had been made by an act that was itself a form of imbalance. She carried that origin in her, the way a stone carries the force of its quarrying in its grain. The beauty was not simply beauty, it was a consequence. It was the visible surface of something that had accumulated in the deep working of things, and it was Nemesis's own, in the strange sense that it had come from her and would return to her. Eventually, through the long accounting, Helen was about 8 years old when Nemesis came close enough to see her face clearly for the first time. The girl was in the courtyard of the palace. She was doing nothing remarkable, sitting on a low wall with a piece of cloth in her hands, working at some kind of folding or arrangement that held her attention. The afternoon light came at an angle across the stone and caught her hair. She did not look up. Nemesis stood in the shadow of the colonnade. She was not visible. The child could not have known she was there. She looked at the girl's face for a long time. There was no feeling in her that she had a name for, not tenderness exactly, not regret. The measuring rod lay along her forearm as it always did, both pans steady, the thread taut. The needle between the pans was level. It had not shifted. But there was something in the looking that was not purely corrective, something that was simply the act of seeing clearly what one had made and knowing it for what it was. The girl was beautiful. She was also subject to the same forces as everything else. There was nothing in her face that would protect her from what was coming. Nemesis did not believe in the kind of mercy that exempts one thing from the laws that govern all things. She had not been made for that. Helen folded the cloth and set it down on the wall beside her. She tilted her head slightly, looking at something in the courtyard that Nemesis could not see from her angle. Then she slid off the wall and walked away through a doorway, and the courtyard was empty again. The afternoon light moved across the stone. Nemesis stood in the colonnade a moment longer. The palace sounds continued around her. Somewhere in the interior, a woman's voice gave instructions, and a door opened and closed. The river could be heard faintly, the Eurotas carrying its cold water south through the plain. The relationship between Nemesis and Helen was not the kind of relationship that could be described in ordinary terms. They had not spoken. They would not speak. The girl did not know her mother's name, or that the word mother could apply to the goddess who had stood in the shadow of her palace and watched her with steady, impartial attention. Nemesis knew this. She understood that the distance between them was not a failure of the relationship. It was the relationship. She was not Leda, who had held the egg in warm hands and waited. She was not a woman of the palace. Her care, if it could be called that, expressed itself differently. It expressed itself in the keeping of the account, in the fact that nothing that touched Helen would go unrecorded, that the chain of consequence that had begun in the marsh at Ramnus would be followed carefully to its last link. She left the palace of Sparta as she had come to it, without sound, without visible passage. The river continued south. Helen grew. The years that followed were ordinary years in most of their details. The way most years are ordinary in their details, even when they carry something extraordinary inside them. The child became a girl, and the girl became a young woman. And the beauty that had been precise but quiet in childhood became the kind of thing that was very difficult to ignore. Nemesis did not watch all of it. She had other work. There were other accounts to maintain, other imbalances accumulating in other places. The world was not short of hubris. It was never short of hubris. But she kept Helen in a particular part of her attention, not because she owed it, because the origin at Ramnus had made it so. The egg had been laid on that particular ground, and the ground remembered, and Nemesis was the keeper of what the ground remembered. A young man from Troy would come to Sparta eventually. He would see Helen at a feast, and the balance in the deep working of things would begin to tip. Not all at once. These things rarely moved all at once. They moved the way cold moves through stone, by increments, by slow degrees, until the day you pressed your palm to the surface and understood that the warmth was entirely gone. Nemesis carried the measuring rod. Both pans level, the thread straight between them. She waited with the patience of something that does not age and does not tire, and the Eurotas moved south through the plain below Sparta, and the water was cold and clear over its pale stones. While the Eurotas moved south, and Helen grew toward the fate that had been set in motion long before her birth, something else was moving, something that had nothing to do with Sparta, or with the egg, or with the particular chain of consequence that ran from the marsh at Ramnus through the palace of a Laconian king. It had to do with stone. The Persians had come to the coast of Attica with a block of Parian marble, white marble, dense and fine-grained, quarried from the island of Paros, where the stone came out of the earth like compacted light. They had brought it across the Aegean on their ships, which sat low in the water with the weight of it. They intended to use it for a monument. This was the nature of the thing they had planned. They would defeat the Greeks at Marathon. They would raise a victory column on that shore. The marble was already cut to rough shape, already beginning its transformation from raw stone into the form of triumph. This is what hubris looks like from the outside. It looks like careful planning. It looks like logistics. It looks like men measuring stone on a beach and deciding where the light will fall best on an inscription. Nemesis observed it without urgency. She had seen this particular arrangement before. The oversized ambition, the premature monument, the counting of a victory before the battle had ended. These were familiar patterns, and she recognized them the way a reader recognizes a word they have read many hundreds of times. The needle between the pans of the measuring rod shifted slightly, not dramatically, just enough to register. The battle at Marathon settled the question that the Persians had already answered in their own minds. The Greeks held the plain. The Persian forces withdrew to their ships. The marble block remained on the shore, uncarved, unused, its intended inscription never written. It stayed there for some time afterward. The stone that was going to record a triumph recorded nothing. It sat on the Attic coast while the story around it continued to move. Battles elsewhere, negotiations, the slow reassertion of things that had nearly been lost. Eventually, the marble was taken north along the coast to Rhamnus. This is the thing about the accounting that Nemesis kept. It had a precision that ordinary events rarely achieved. The stone the Persians had brought to Marathon for their monument ended up at the sanctuary in Rhamnus. It ended up in the hands of a sculptor named Agoracritus, a student of Phidias, who worked the block over a long period of time, cutting away what was not needed, refining what remained. What emerged from the stone was her face, not a face she had chosen, not a likeness she had sat for in the way a mortal subject might sit for a portrait, but a sculptor's understanding of what the goddess of retribution looked like, rendered in the same marble the Persians had brought for their own glory. Hubris had carried the stone to the place where it would become a record of hubris's correction. The Persians had transported the material for their own monument, and the monument that resulted bore the face of the force that had undone them. Nemesis considered this for a long time. Not with satisfaction. Something more neutral than that. It was accurate. It was the kind of accuracy she valued. The block had arrived at its proper destination by the proper means. The stone had been put to its proper use. The sanctuary at Rhamnus was not a large place. It sat above the marsh on a low promontory, the sea visible from its steps, the reed grass of the plain below it bending in the wind off the water. There were 2 temples on the site, one older and smaller, one newer and more carefully built. The statue would stand in the newer temple, the white marble cool in the interior shade. Agoracritus gave the figure an apple branch in one hand. Around her crown he carved figures of Ethiopians, and a deer stood at her side. The whip and the bridle he rendered with care, the bridle especially, which she carried to check what ran too fast, to slow what was exceeding its proper pace. The measuring rod he placed across her lap, both pans level, the thread straight, the needle between them still. She stood in the temple above the marsh where the egg had been laid, above the reed grass and the grey water and the pale winter light that had been present at the beginning of this particular chain. The ground beneath the temple remembered. The sculptor had not known this, working his chisel through cold marble in the lamplight. The marble did not know it, but the ground remembered, and what the ground remembered was enough. Nemesis had not stood in that marsh since the morning she had left it. She had no particular reason to return. The accounting did not require her physical presence in every place where consequence was accumulating, but she came back once after the statue was complete. She stood at the edge of the marsh below the sanctuary and looked up at the temple for a moment without going inside. The sea was audible from there, a low, continuous sound from beyond the promontory. The reed grass moved. The water of the marsh was still and grey in the morning light, the same grey it had always been. The statue inside the temple had her attributes correctly arranged. The sculptor had worked from convention and from the accumulated understanding of what she was. He had not been wrong in any significant way. The measuring rod across the lap was correct. The level needle was correct. The 2 pans in balance were correct. What he had not been able to capture, because no sculptor could, was the patience, the quality of waiting that did not tire. the way she could hold a thread taut across years and decades without the thread slackening, the way the account was always open, always being kept, and never closed prematurely. That was not a thing you could put in stone, but the stone was there, and the stone was enough for mortals who needed something they could see and approach and lay offerings before. She did not object to that. It was the proper function of a sanctuary. Mortals needed the visible form of the forces that move through their lives. They needed to be able to stand before a face and understand, even approximately, what that face meant. The face in the white marble looked south toward the marsh and the sea. The measuring rod lay across its lap in the interior shade. Both pans were level. The needle was still. Below the promontory, the reed grass bent in the wind, and the water of the marsh held the grey light of the morning sky, and somewhere far to the south the Eurotas continued its cold passage toward the sea, carrying whatever it carried, as it had carried things since before the palace on its bank had been built, and as it would carry things long after the palace was gone. The mortals who came to Ramnus came for different reasons. Some came in distress. They had been wronged and had no other recourse. The courts had not helped them, or the courts were not available to them, or the person who had wronged them was more powerful than any court could reach. They came up the path from the plain with offerings wrapped in cloth, figs, small cakes, pieces of cloth folded with care. They set them on the steps of the newer temple and spoke their grievances aloud, sometimes in a whisper, sometimes not. Some came out of fear. They had done well, too well perhaps. Their harvests had been exceptional. Their ships had returned full. Their children had survived when neighbours' children had not. They came to the sanctuary to acknowledge the imbalance, to name it before she named it for them, to place something on the scales themselves rather than wait for the scales to move without warning. This was a kind of wisdom. Nemesis noticed it without warmth, but she noticed it. The mortal who understood the nature of the accounting was easier to regard than the one who did not. The farmer who came up the hill with a small cake and quiet words had already done something right. He had looked at his good fortune and asked what it cost. He had not assumed the cost was nothing. The assumption that the cost was nothing, that was where accounts began to accumulate interest. The older temple at the site was modest. Its stones were worn in places, the carving above the entrance rubbed to smoothness by decades of salt wind off the sea. It had stood through the Persian occupation of Attica, when the army moved through the countryside burning what it found. The older temple had survived that passage. Whether by oversight or by some older caution even soldiers knew to observe, it had been left standing. The newer temple rose beside it with more precision. Its columns were more carefully spaced. The stone had been laid with greater attention to level and line. It was the kind of building that would still be standing a long time from now, though no one who built it would live to know that. Inside the newer temple, the white marble figure stood in the dim interior light. The statue was large enough to require the full height of the room. Visitors entering from the brightness outside would have needed a moment for their eyes to adjust. Then the figure would have resolved itself from shadow, the apple branch, the deer, the crown with its carved Ethiopians, the measuring rod across the lap. The face was still. Cool stone caught the low light that came through the entrance. The eyes did not follow. The expression gave nothing away. Visitors stood before it in silence mostly. Some spoke. Some placed additional offerings at the base, folded cloth or small vessels of oil or bundles of dried herbs that released their scent slowly in the enclosed air. The herbs were sage and thyme mostly. Their smell was the smell of the dry Attic hillsides. It was appropriate. The sanctuary belonged to this particular ground. The apple branch in the figure's hand had a specific meaning that most visitors understood, at least in outline. The apple was a marker of judgment. It recalled the moment before great choices were made, choices that seemed like blessings and turned out to be otherwise. Mortals associated it with beauty and with the complications that followed from beauty. They were not wrong exactly. They had arrived at the right image by a slightly incomplete path. The deer at her side was older in meaning. Deer were swift and clean in their motion, precise in their movement through terrain. They did not move recklessly. When something alarmed them, they went still before they ran, reading the landscape with full attention. The deer was a figure of discernment, of motion that was not hasty. The Ethiopians carved into her crown referred to the southernmost peoples known to Greek geography, figures from the far edge of the known world, where the sun's heat was understood to be most direct and most honest. The south was the direction of the sun's highest arc, the place of fullest light where nothing was hidden in shadow. The crown pointed toward that exposure, toward the condition of being fully seen. These were the meanings that had accumulated around her over centuries of observation and interpretation. They had arrived at them by watching the patterns, by noticing which outcomes followed which behaviors, by attending to the shape of consequence over time. The accumulated observation of many generations had produced a picture that was recognizable. Not complete, but recognizable. The whip required less interpretation. It was understood. The bridle was understood. The measuring rod was understood. What was less easily articulated was the relationship between the instruments. The whip and the bridle were not opposites. The bridle did not cancel the whip. Both were forms of correction, applied at different stages. The bridle was for what was accelerating beyond its proper pace. The whip was for what had already arrived at a place where acceleration had carried it past correction into consequence. Both were held by the same figure. The same hand that measured was the hand that corrected. There was no separation between the accounting and the instrument. This was what mortals found difficult to hold in mind when they stood before the statue. They wanted the figure to be either merciful or severe. They wanted to know which kind of deity they were addressing. But the figure in the white marble was neither precisely. The face gave nothing away because nothing was predetermined. The account was open. The pans were level. What happened next depended on what had been placed on each side of the scale. The needle was still because the moment was still. It would not remain still indefinitely. Outside, the wind moved through the reed grass of the plain below the promontory. The marsh water shifted in it, small ripples crossing the grey surface before settling again. The sea beyond was audible from the steps of the sanctuary, that low continuous sound that did not change with weather or season, but only deepened or faded, depending on how closely one listened. Offerings left on the steps dried in the salt air. The cloth faded. The small cakes crumbled and were taken by birds. The vessels of oil sat until they were removed by the priests who kept the sanctuary. All of this was the ordinary passage of things at a cult site. It was the proper function of the place, and the place fulfilled it. The priests came from families who had tended the site for several generations. They knew the protocols. They knew which days required particular observances and which allowed ordinary maintenance. They kept the interior of the temple swept. They replaced the oil in the lamps that lit the statue's interior on festival days. On those days, the white marble was lit more fully than usual. Visitors who came for the festival would see the figure clearly for the first time, the fine grain of the stone, the careful carving of the deer's legs, the precise rendering of the measuring rod. Agoracritus had worked the surfaces with patience. The lamplight found every plane and settled there. The figure looked south. The marsh below the promontory held the sky's reflection. The reed grass bent. The sea continued beyond. The accounting continued, as it had since before the sanctuary was built, as it had since before the marsh was named, as it had since before the first mortal looked at their own good fortune and failed to ask what it cost. The needle between the two pans remained still. waiting, as it had always waited, for what would next be placed on either side. Far to the west of Rhamnus, in the green valleys below Helicon, there was a youth named Narcissus. He had been born with a face that stopped people mid-motion. Travellers paused on the road. Women at the well forgot what they had come for. Even the nymphs who wandered the forested slopes found reasons to linger where he walked, hoping for a glance in their direction. He did not give it. This was not shyness. Narcissus moved through the world with full awareness of his effect on others. He simply found none of them worth his time. They approached, and he turned away. They spoke, and he did not answer. The beauty that had been given to him he wore like a door, closed and bolted, and the bolting was not accidental. Among those who found him were the ones who could not help themselves. They saw the face, and something opened in them. They offered what they had. He returned nothing. Not a word, not a look that acknowledged what had been offered. Just a stillness that held them at distance, and then his back, and then the space where he had stood. One of them was a nymph named Echo. She had arrived at her peculiarity through a history that had nothing to do with Narcissus. Hera had shortened her speech as punishment for distractions, long conversations that had given Zeus cover when he needed it. Echo had been reduced to repetition. She could not speak first. She could only return what had last been said to her, the final syllables sent back like a stone off a wall. It was a strange way to live. She heard everything and could offer only a portion of it back. She listened to the world in full and gave the world its own ending, reflected. When she found Narcissus in the forest above the valley, something moved in her that had not moved in a long time. She watched him from behind the trees. She followed at a distance that she tried to keep careful and could not always manage. She knew the shape of his voice from hearing him speak to no one in particular. She collected it the way someone collects what has fallen and cannot be retrieved. She wanted to speak to him. What she wanted to say was something open and unguarded. But she had only what she was given. She could only wait for his words and return them, and hope that the returning might somehow say the thing she meant. One afternoon he stopped in a clearing and looked around him. He had heard something. He called out, "Who is there? Who is there?" Echo answered. He looked around, saw no one. He called again, "Come here." "Come here," she returned. She stepped from the trees. She moved toward him as she had wanted to move toward him for a long time, her arms lifted. Her face carried what she felt, and it was not concealed. He saw her. He looked at what was approaching him, and he stepped back. "Go," he said. "I would rather die than have you hold me." "Have you hold me," she said. She could not say anything else. She returned his sentence, and it cut her as it left her, because what she was giving back was not what she meant, but what he had said, and what he had said was the opposite of what she had offered. She withdrew into the trees. She did not follow him again. She moved deeper into the hills, and found the places where rock met rock, where caves opened into the quiet interior of the mountain, and there she remained, without a body that needed anything, without a voice that could begin anything, only the endings of other voices. Only the last sound that anyone near her made returned. She became, in time, purely that. The repetition without the source. The stone that held the shape of sound and sent it back. Her flesh dissolved, and what remained was attached to the cliff faces and the hollow places where the air moved through rock. She was the echo before anyone knew to call it by her name. This was what Narcissus had made of her, not intentionally. He had simply refused, and the refusal had been enough. He was not the first she had loved. He was not the only one who had been cruel by way of indifference, but he was the one whose cruelty had been complete enough to finish the work. Others had been treated as she had. There had been nymphs before her who had offered themselves to Narcissus and been turned away with the same flat dismissal. A young man who had extended friendship and been returned mockery. Each of them had carried something afterward, a wound that didn't close, a diminishment they couldn't account for. Several had prayed, not always with words. Sometimes the prayer was only the shape of the grief, held upward with nowhere else to go. Nemesis received it. She had been watching the patterns for a long time, not watching as a person watches, with fixed attention and a chosen direction, but watching as the scales watch, which is to say, receiving what is placed on them and measuring what is there. The prayers of the dismissed and the diminished had been placed on one side. Narcissus's accumulating refusal had been placed on the other. The pan with the prayers had descended. It was not a matter of deciding. The scales had already decided. What remained was the question of form. There was a pool near the groves of Thespiae. It sat in a place where the rock had made a natural hollow and a spring fed it from beneath. The water was clear. Still on most days. The kind of stillness that was not the absence of movement, but the perfect balance of movement, the incoming water and the slow seep outward exactly matched. So the surface held without disruption. It was the quality of the water that mattered, not the place in any particular sense. The place was simply where the water was. And the water was what it was, a surface that gave back what came near it, precisely and without alteration. A face above it would see a face below. Every detail returned, every line held exactly. Narcissus was already moving toward it. He had been hunting. The day was warm. He was thirsty, and he had been through this terrain before, and he knew the pool was there. He had no reason to suspect anything. He moved through the trees the way he always moved, without hurry, without concern for what his passage meant to anything around him. The birds moved when he passed. The light through the canopy was irregular, broken into pieces by the leaves overhead. He reached the pool. He knelt. He leaned over the water, and he saw the face below him. He did not know it. This is the part that mortals who told the story later found difficult to accept, because it seemed impossible that he should fail to recognize his own reflection. But the recognition was of a different kind than they imagined. He saw the face. He saw what the face was. He felt something move in him that had not moved before. Not recognition of himself, recognition of the standard he had held others to. He had wanted, without knowing he had wanted it, to look at something that met what he required, and the water gave him exactly that. It gave him himself, the most complete version of what he had been seeking in the faces of everyone he had turned away. He stayed at the pool. He did not leave before dark. He was there the next morning. Nemesis did not approach. She had no reason to approach. The correction was already underway. The account had been opened, and the opening was sufficient. She moved in other directions, as she always did, carrying the measuring rod that was never at rest, reading the pans that were never quite still, finding the places where the needle had begun to move. The pool held the face, and the face held the pool, each one waiting for the other to look away first. Narcissus did not reach for the face. That was the first thing. Others who had leaned over water had seen themselves and understood immediately what they were looking at. The slight delay, the mirroring of their own movement had told them. But Narcissus kept very still. He had learned stillness early, as people do who are used to being looked at. He knew how to hold himself without shifting, and so the face below him held as well. Perfectly, without the small fidgets and adjustments that would have broken the illusion. He watched it for a long time before he moved again. When he finally moved, the face moved too. He stopped. The face stopped. He understood then, at least the surface of what was happening. He understood that the face was his. But understanding did not break the hold. If anything, it deepened it. Because he had never seen himself with this quality of attention before. He had seen himself in bronze mirrors, in the polished faces of vessels, in the brief flash of a still puddle after rain. But those surfaces were imperfect. They returned something approximate. This pool returned everything. He stayed through the heat of the afternoon. The hunting was forgotten. The dogs, if he had brought them, found their own way back to the valley. The light moved across the canopy above him, and the shadows on the water shifted with it, but the face remained. He spoke to it eventually. Not knowing he was doing so, a small sound, half breath, half word. The syllables went out over the water and broke the surface for a moment, a ring of disturbance moving out from the centre. The face rippled. He waited. The water steadied. The face returned. What came back to him was the last syllable he had made, carried off the rock behind him, returned across the air. He did not know what it was. He heard it as an answer. He heard it as the beginning of something he had not expected to find. The hills held it. The hollow place in the rock, where echo had already become part of the stone, she had not spoken first. She had not been able to. She could only return what came to her. His own sound returned to him, wearing a shape he could almost believe was hers. It was the last thing she gave him. She did not know she gave it. He spent the night beside the pool. The dew came down. The air cooled. The surface of the water went dark with the dark above it, and the face below him became harder to see, but he did not move. He lay on the rock beside the pool's edge and looked into the water and waited for enough light to return the face to him. The next morning it was there. He had not eaten. He was not particularly troubled by this. He watched the face move when he moved, be still when he was still. He began to speak to it at intervals, not loudly, low sounds that barely cleared the surface of the water. And each time the last sound returned from the rock walls of the hollow, quiet and exact. Nemesis moved through other territories. She did not require the pool to proceed without her. The correction was not an event that needed to be administered. It was a condition that had been created, and conditions, once set, persisted of their own weight. She moved through the lowlands south of the valley. There was a merchant whose transactions had been uneven for several seasons now, taking more than the exchange warranted, in small increments no one could easily name. She read what the scales showed and moved on. There was a soldier, decorated now, whose decoration had cost another man, a name he would never recover. She noted the angle of the needle. She moved on. These were not the same order of account as Narcissus, but they were accounts. They were all part of the same continuous work. The rod in her hand was never lowered. The pans were never still. She did not think about Narcissus specifically. He had been entered. The scale had recorded what was there. What happened at the pool was not something she directed, any more than the water directed the face it returned. The pool was simply what it was. Narcissus was simply where he was. These two things had met, and the meeting was doing what meetings of this kind always do. Back at the pool, days passed. He grew thinner. The face in the water grew thinner with him. He noticed this. He noted with something close to sorrow the slight hollowing of the cheeks, the deeper line at the corner of the mouth. He did not connect these changes to himself. He saw them as changes in the face he was watching, signs that the face was suffering, that something was reducing it. This was the truest part of the correction, not that he was deprived of water or food. He could have drunk from the spring at any time, cupped his hands and lifted the water, let the face dissolve and wait for it to resettle. He could have eaten from the forest around him. Nothing prevented this. What prevented it was his attention. His attention had finally found an object worthy of itself, and the attention held. He had given this to others. Not the object of his regard, but the condition of it, nymphs who had followed him across hillsides. The young man with the outstretched hand, Echo, moving through the trees with a silence that was not indifference but caution. All of them had looked at him the way he now looked at the water. All of them had held still, waiting for the face to acknowledge them. The pool did not acknowledge him. This was the last refinement. It moved when he moved. It held when he held. It gave back exactly what he gave. But it did not initiate. It did not approach. It had no feeling toward him, no preference for his presence over his absence. It was what all reflecting surfaces are, complete indifference, wearing the costume of perfect attention. Wildflowers grew around the pool's edge. Small ones, pale yellow and white, rooted in the thin soil where the rock gave way to something softer. They bent a little when the wind moved through the hollow. He did not look at them, he looked at the face in the water. The days were shortening by small degrees. The quality of the light in the afternoon was changing. He was still there when the first cold morning arrived, the air carrying a sharpness it had not had before. His breath moved above the water in a faint cloud. The face below him breezed back. Nemesis passed through Ramnus toward the coast. The air off the sea was different from the air in the groves, saltier, more direct. She paused there where the high ground looked down toward the water. The temple was not yet built. The marble was not yet cut, but the ground was already what it would become, a place where the measuring work was recognized, where someone had thought to mark it. She did not stay long. There were other accounts moving. Back among the groves of Thespiae, at the pool in the rock hollow, the flower that grew from the place where Narcissus had knelt was still opening. It faced the water. The flower had opened fully by the time Nemesis returned to the wider work. She carried it in her attention the way she carried all completed entries. Not with sentiment, not with finality, simply as a thing recorded. The hollow among the groves of Thespiae had done what it was made to do. The correction there was past the point of requiring observation. Her road east was unhurried. The ground here was familiar, the low hills terraced where farmers had cleared them, the paths worn smooth between villages whose names she had known for a long time. She did not walk in the way mortals walk, with effort, with fatigue. She moved as the measurement moves, from one point to the next, neither slow nor swift, present where presence was required. The scales at her side were settled, not empty, never empty. But the pans had found their level for this interval, and she carried them without adjustment. It was the air that told her first. She had come far enough east that the hills flattened and the smell of the sea reached her on a wind that carried salt an open distance. She paused on a rise where she could see the plain below her. The plain was wide and old. Dust moved across it in thin lines. Below, at the coast, the water was grey and still in the late afternoon, and something was happening there that she recognized before she could name it. Ships. There were many of them. More than the fishing boats, more than the traders. These were ships carrying men and supplies across the grey water toward a shoreline she could not see from here, but knew was there. She had known it was there for some time. Sparta was west of her, Troy was east. And in the space between them, across the water she could see from the ridge. The retribution was beginning its long outward expression. Helen had sailed. Nemesis did not feel this as triumph or sorrow. She registered it as a measurement will register when the weight placed upon the pan is exactly what the account requires, a kind of precision, a kind of settling. The thing had been set in motion before the egg, before the marsh at Ramnus, before Zeus had folded his great wings and left her on the ground with something that had no name yet. The account had been opened then. What she watched now was its working. Helen was her daughter. She did not think of her often in those terms. Leda had raised her. Sparta had shaped her. The beauty that had accumulated in that child was not Nemesis's doing, not exactly, though perhaps it could not have been otherwise given who had carried it. Beauty that large, that unearned by any effort of the girl herself, was always going to draw the account toward settling. It had been drawn from the beginning. Nemesis watched the water. The ships were small at this distance. Points of movement on a grey field. She could not see the faces of the men aboard them, but she knew what the faces held. Pride, mostly. The specific brightness of men who believed the cause was righteous, that the gods were watching with approval, that fortune had chosen them. Fortune had chosen some of them. Others had simply walked into the orbit of an account that was never theirs to settle. This was not her doing. She had not arranged armies. She had not called ships from their harbours. She had laid an egg in a marsh and stepped back, and the world had done what the world does when an element of this magnitude is introduced. The war was not her instrument. The war was what happened when someone stole from a scale that had already been balanced. Paris had stolen. She noted that. She had noted it when it happened, the way she noted the merchant in the lowlands, the decorated soldier. The scale had moved. A name had been taken. A household had been disrupted. The magnitude of the disruption was larger in this case, but the principle was the same. What made it different was not Paris. It was Agamemnon. She turned her attention to the plain below. The armies moving across it were not purely his, but the will that organized them was. And that will had its own account, older than the fleet, older than the ships, accumulating in the way that pride accumulates. Incrementally, in acts too small to name individually, in slights given without acknowledgement, in decisions made from the assumption that consequence had been suspended for someone of sufficient power. The scale showed his account clearly. She read it. It was not done accumulating. She moved down from the ridge toward the plain. The grass was dry here, bleached by the late season sun. The wind pushed it sideways. She walked through it without it bending for her, and without her requiring it to. The accounts on this plain were numerous, more than she could attend to individually. There were men whose good fortune had gone unchallenged too long. There were men who deserved the bronze they carried, whose names were entered correctly, whose presence here was neither excessive nor insufficient. She moved among them all and made no distinction that was not already written in the pans. Achilles was on the water. She could feel the account of him even at this distance. It was a precise account, one of the sharpest she had encountered in this age. Not because he was violent. Violence alone was not what the scales weighted. It was because his wrath, when it came, would not remain proportional to its cause. He would feel the insult clearly and respond beyond the scale of the insult, and that excess would cost him something the account had not yet specified. It would specify it. She was patient. The grey sea moved in slow lines against the shore. The ships were passing now, growing smaller. She watched them until they were lines, then points, then gone into the haze over the water. The retribution that had begun in a marsh at Ramnus, in a union she had not chosen, was now a thing that would take a generation to complete. Cities would fall, names would be lost. Men who had been decorated would find their decorations insufficient against what the sea and their own pride would bring. She was not its executioner. She had never been. She was the condition. She was the principle that had been present from the beginning, before the egg, before the chase, before Nyx had first given her the rod and the scales and sent her into the world where the accounts were waiting. The measuring work was not cruel. It was simply the form the cosmos took when it remembered itself. She turned from the shore. The ridge behind her was pale in the late light. The grass moved. The sea below was settling into its evening colour, something between grey and bronze, wide and unhurried. One last gull crossed the water, calling once, and was gone. She moved on. The scales were level. The rod was steady. There were other accounts moving. The years moved the way accounts move, not in bursts. In steady increments, each one small, each one recorded. She did not watch Troy from one place. She moved through the plain, through the camps, through the long corridors of the siege, as it stretched from one season into the next. The walls of the city rose above the dusty ground. They were old walls, built with care, reinforced with pride. Nemesis read the stones the way she read faces. The pride in them was not excessive. Priam had built well and known it. That was not the same as hubris. She noted the distinction. The accounts she followed most closely were the Greek ones. Agamemnon's account continued to accumulate even as his armies dug in. He moved through the camp as though the war belonged to him personally. The other kings deferred. The men below him deferred further. Each deference fed the assumption that consequence was a thing for lesser men. Each assumption added to the pan. She watched him take Achilles' prize. She noted the moment. The scale moved. Achilles withdrew to his ship. His wrath was a careful thing in those first days, cold rather than hot, held behind his ribs like water behind a dam. She read the account of it. The wrath itself was not what mattered. What mattered was what it would cost him when it moved beyond what the insult required. She waited. The city held. Seasons passed across the plain. Men died in numbers that did not require counting individually. Each name found its correct place in the record. For most of them, the accounts were proportional. They had come for reasons the scale recognized. Fortune had entered, and fortune was now leaving. This was not correction. This was completion. Patroclus put on Achilles' armor. She felt that account shift before he reached the field. There was a quality to certain actions, a brightness, a forward motion that pulled at what came after, the way a stone pulls water toward it as it sinks. He walked toward the walls. He drove the Trojans back. He went further than he had been asked to go. That furtherness was the thing. She read it clearly. He had exceeded the charge. Not from malice, not from pride exactly. From the momentum of the moment, from the specific heat of battle that makes the next step feel like necessity, he went too far. The scale marked it. He did not return from the field. Achilles heard it from a long way off. She was near enough to observe, but took no position close to him. The sound he made when the news arrived was not a sound she waited. Grief was not an entry in the record. Grief was what the record produced in others. She noted it and moved on. What came after she watched carefully. Hector fell beneath Achilles' spear on the plain before the walls. The account of that death was clean. A warrior of Troy, measured carefully, whose name had been entered with precision across the years of the siege. His dying did not move the scale. What Achilles did with the body moved it. He dragged Hector behind his chariot, 3 times around the walls of the city. Then again. The act was not proportional to the insult he had suffered. The insult had been real. Agamemnon had taken what was his. Patroclus had died in his armor. These were entries the scale recognized. But Hector had not been the author of those entries, and what was done to him went beyond the demand of the account. The scale registered the excess. She read it. Achilles' own account had now specified what it owed. She had waited for the specification. Now it was written. He did not die that day. He continued through the siege, brilliant and terrible, moving across the plain with a precision she acknowledged. His fighting was not excessive. His grief had found an outlet that was proportional, mostly. But the day at the chariot wheel had been entered, and entries did not leave the record simply because the one who made them had returned to proportion afterward. Paris drew the bow on the field. The arrow found the heel. She noted it. The account was discharged, not by her hand, not by any single hand. The account had been written across years in actions too numerous to attribute to one moment. The arrow was only the final notation. The sum had been reaching this figure for a long time. She turned her attention to the walls. Within the city, the accounts were older and differently composed. Priams had accumulated not through hubris, but through the specific weight of a city that had held too long against what the cosmos had already determined. The length of the holding had not changed the determination. It had only made the resolution more complete when it arrived. The horse was a Greek invention. She observed it from a distance, the work of Epeios, shaped with care, hollow within. She read no hubris in the craft. The craft was clean. What lived inside it was another matter, but the accounts of those men had already been entered. They were carrying out a correction that had been building since the ships first left the harbour. The city fell at night. She moved through the smoke without breathing it. The walls came down, not all at once, but in sections, each section following the previous, with a logic that felt inevitable from where she stood. The accounts resolved in rapid sequence across the burning hours. Names she had been tracking for years closed. Others opened. Because destruction at this scale always opened new accounts, acts performed in the heat of sacking that exceeded what the correction required. Ajax the Lesser entered Athena's temple. She noted it. The scale moved sharply. He took Cassandra from the goddess's sanctuary, from the base of the goddess's statue, where the girl had placed herself under divine protection. The act was not proportional to anything. It was not correction. It was appetite made action in a moment when appetite had no restraint. She read the account. It was a large entry. Athena's claim on it was prior to hers, and she did not compete with prior claims. But she noted that this account would reach settlement on the water on the return voyage when the fleet believed itself to be finished with consequence. The believing itself was part of the account. The ships were loaded before dawn. The victors moved toward the harbour with what they were carrying, in their arms and in their records. She moved among them. She did not select. She did not mark any man who had not already marked himself. The sea was quiet when the fleet departed. It would not remain so. She stood on the shore as the last ships cleared the headland. The smoke from the city was still rising behind her. It caught the early light, grey-white, against a pale sky. The walls of Troy, what remained of them, stood against the smoke without expression. Helen was on one of those ships. Nemesis watched it until it was gone. Her daughter, raised by Leda, shaped by Sparta, standing at the centre of an account she had never authored and could not have escaped. The beauty had always been going to draw this. It had been drawn from the beginning. Now the drawing was complete. The sea was very still. The smoke moved east on the dry wind. She turned from the water. The rod was steady across her arm. The scales held their position. Troy was entered. The accounts of the victors were not yet resolved, and the sea between this shore and their harbours was already beginning to gather what those accounts required. She walked back through the ash-pale grass above the shore, and the sound of the water fell away behind her. The road north from the shore was pale with dust. Nemesis walked it without haste, the rod balanced across her forearm, the scales hanging steady at her side. The Aegean opened to her left. She could see the dark shapes of the fleet still moving on the water, the sails small now, growing smaller. The ships had divided into formations that would not hold. She read the formations the way she read other arrangements. They looked like order. They were not order. They were men who believed the accounting was behind them. She let them believe it. The road curved inland past a grove of scrub oak. The leaves were dry. This late in the season they held their colour but not their suppleness, and when the wind moved through them the sound was papery and low. She noted it without attending to it. Her attention was distributed across the water. Agamemnon's ships were at the western edge of the fleet. His account was large. She had been reading it since the first sacrifice at Aulis, where he had misread what was owed to Artemis and paid with his daughter. That entry had not closed the account. It had opened it. Each subsequent act of assumption had added weight, the taking of Briseis, the posture of command without restraint, the steady accumulation of impunity built across 10 years of successful siege. He was sailing home. He was planning an entrance. She did not follow his particular ship. She did not need to. She knew where his account would settle. Mycenae was waiting. Clytemnestra was waiting. The entrance he was planning and the one he would receive had been moving toward each other for years. Two currents that would converge in a dim corridor behind a palace gate. That settlement was not hers to administer. She recognized whose it was and deferred, as she always deferred when prior claims existed. What she noted was that the account would reach its figure. Of that she had no uncertainty. The scale confirmed it without needing to move. She crossed a low ridge. The sea dropped behind the tree line, and the sound of it became faint. The road ahead stretched toward the valley towns, quiet in the late morning, smoke from cook fires. The smell of turned earth. Someone had already replanted a field that the army's passage had torn through. She passed it without slowing. The replanting was not her concern. But she observed it, the human habit of repair following behind destruction, with a patience that was not unlike her own. Poseidon was already working. She could not see him. She did not need to. She could feel the shift in the water's disposition from where she walked, the way the surface of the sea had hardened, the way the depth had taken on a different quality of intention. Poseidon had been watching the departure too. Ajax's act in the temple had reached him through Athena's anger. Athena had appealed, and Poseidon had agreed to apply his portion of the reckoning on the open water. She noted this. When two prior claims intersected and reinforced each other, the settlement was often dramatic in scale. The fleet did not know yet what it was sailing into. She descended the far side of the ridge. The road levelled out across a plain that had been farmland, or had resembled farmland before 10 years of armies moving through it. Some of the field markers still stood, others had been removed or broken. The geometry of what the land had been was still legible if one knew how to read land. She read it. The geometry held an older account. This land had been cultivated by people whose names had entered no heroic record and whose entries had resolved quietly. Through drought and blight and the ordinary weight of lives lived close to the earth. Those accounts were different from the ones she had been tracking. They were not entries of hubris. They were simply the accumulated mass of finite lives. She did not administer those. She passed them like a reader passing pages that belonged to a different text. The plain opened into a wide basin. A river ran through it, shallow and clear. She crossed at the stones and paused on the far bank. The scales moved faintly. She looked down at them. The motion was small, a settling rather than a tipping. One of the fleet's ships had encountered the first weather, a small entry, not yet resolved, just beginning. She noted the figure and held it. Then she looked up at the sky. The cloud formation over the western water was building. It had the particular density and architecture of weather that Poseidon was directing with intention rather than chance. The clouds were not dramatic yet. They would become dramatic. She had seen this configuration before, the way the pressure built across an afternoon before releasing into something that stripped masts from decks and pushed hulls off their courses toward unforgiving rock. She was not indifferent to what was coming. She did not feel indifference. What she felt was closer to confirmation. The scale had always been going to move this way. The confirmation was not satisfying, and it was not distressing. It was simply accurate. The river moved past her feet. The sound of it was steady, low. Small stones were visible beneath the surface, pale and still. She thought of her daughter. Helen's ship was in the western formation. She had noted its position before the fleet cleared the headland. She had watched it until it was one of many, indistinguishable from the others by sight, but not to her. She knew its account. Helen had no entry of hubris. She had entries of suffering, entries of displacement, entries of a life redirected by forces that had preceded her birth. The account was not one of wrongdoing. It was the account of a woman who had been placed at the center of a correction she had not authored. Her settlement would not be a storm. Nemesis did not track it further for now. She held the figure and set it aside. The rod was cool under her arm. The wind off the plain was dry, carrying the smell of dust and late-season grass. She continued north along the river. The sky above the Aegean had deepened. She could see the leading edge of the weather system Poseidon was building. The way it pressed down on the horizon with a kind of deliberateness that was unmistakable if one understood deliberateness in its divine form. It had weight without being visible weight. It had intent without being loud about the intent. A heron stood in the shallows of the river ahead. It did not move as she approached. Its stillness was complete, the kind that required no effort, the kind that was simply the heron's natural relation to the world around it. She passed it. It did not look up. The settlements on the northern end of the plain were small, old, their walls built from the same pale stone as the riverbed. She moved through one without pausing. Dogs looked at her. A woman carrying a jar from a well looked at her without seeing her. A child sitting in a doorway looked past her entirely. This was her particular quality of movement through the world. She was present in it. She was not of it. The scales held their position as she walked. The Western accounts were open and would remain open until the water had finished what it had begun. Some of those accounts would close within hours. Others would take longer. Odysseus would take much longer. She noted his ship at the far edge of the fleet. His account was distinct from the others. It was not an account of hubris exactly. It was an account of a man who had operated for 10 years at the precise margin of proportion, clever enough to avoid the large entries, not careful enough to avoid all of them. His settlement would be measured accordingly, long but not permanent. Difficult but not final. She did not follow it further. The chapter was not yet his. She reached the high ground above the northern plain. From here the sea was visible again, a grey strip between headlands. The fleet was small now, almost gone from sight. The cloud formation had reached the ships. She watched the leading sails shorten as the crews registered the change in the weather. The rod was steady. The scales did not move. She had read what there was to read here. She turned inland. The sound of the sea continued behind her for a time, low and consistent, and then fell away as the land rose and the wind shifted and the valley closed around the road. The road inland was narrow. Pale dust settled behind her as she walked. The scrub oak on either side of the road held its late leaves, dry and papery, the colour of old bronze. They moved slightly in the wind without sound, without the suppleness of living wood. The season had pressed the moisture out of them weeks ago. Nemesis walked without hurrying. The rod rested across her forearm. The scales hung still. There was an account she had been holding since before the fleet cleared the harbour. She had noted it and set it aside while the larger entries demanded attention. Now, on the inland road with the sea behind her and the valley quiet around her, she returned to it. Agamemnon. His ships were at the western edge of the fleet. They would encounter the weather first, after Ajax's ships. Whether they survived the water was not the question. His account had never been a question of the water. She held the figure and examined it in the way she had learned to examine complicated entries, without moving toward resolution, simply reading what was there. The account had opened at Aulis. That was the first entry. A daughter's life exchanged for favourable winds. The transaction had been precise in its logic, if logic was the correct word for it. He had needed to sail. He had sailed. The wind had come. The cost had been recorded and the entry had remained open through 10 years of war. 10 years. She had watched the accumulation of it. Every decision made from a position of unquestioned authority. Every act carried forward under the assumption that a man who commanded armies was beyond the reach of correction. Not the arrogance of ignorance, something more considered than that. He had known what he had done at Aulis. He had chosen it anyway and then continued choosing, season after season, in the same direction. The epithet came to her as it occasionally did, not as a name she used for herself, but as a description others had arrived at independently. Adrastea, the inescapable one. She had not chosen the name. It had formed around her the way names form around conditions that persist long enough to require a word. Mortals who had observed the pattern of their own histories, who had watched the proud return to correction regardless of how long the interval, had arrived at the name on their own. It was accurate. She had no objection to it. What the name captured was not speed. She was not fast. She was not immediate. The interval between an act and its settlement could stretch across a human lifetime, long enough that the connection became invisible to those looking for it. That was the condition some mistook for escape. Agamemnon had sailed home. She had noted his direction this morning without following it. His account was not hers to close. It was not a question of prior claim exactly. It was a question of what was already in motion. Clytemnestra had been waiting at Mycenae through the same 10 years. Her account was different in nature. What she carried was not hubris. It was a response to the original entry, a settlement of its own kind, drawn from the same opening at Aulis. The chain did not simplify. Nemesis understood this. Justice, if that was the word for what she measured, did not resolve cleanly into single causes and single effects. It moved through families. It moved through generations. The entry at Aulis would not close with Agamemnon's settlement. It would open a new figure, which would itself require another reading further along the line. She did not follow it beyond what was directly in front of her. That was not avoidance. It was precision. An account read too far forward became speculation. She worked from what was actual. The road curved around a low hillside. A grove of olive trees stood on the slope above her, very old, their trunks twisted and pale. The ground beneath them was dry and clean. No one had worked this land recently. The scale shifted, very slightly. She looked at them, a small entry. Not from the water, from the land. Somewhere inland and to the south, a figure who had extended his luck past his natural boundary had encountered the beginning of a correction. She read the entry without interest in its drama. The account was minor. It would resolve in its own time without her attention. She noted the figure and let it settle. What she found herself returning to as the road flattened and the valley widened was not the fleet, not the open accounts or the weather building to the west. She found herself returning to the nature of the work itself. The word retribution followed her through centuries of human description. She had never found it wrong exactly. But it was incomplete. Retribution implied a response to a grievance. What she carried was not a grievance. She had no injury to answer. She had no anger to resolve. What she maintained was proportion. The relationship between what a life accumulated and what a life received in return. When that relationship drifted too far from its proper measure, the drift itself created a pressure, and the pressure sought release. She was not the release. She was the reading of the pressure. The instrument that registered when a life had moved past the margin where correction was optional. After that, the correction found its own form. The valley floor was wider now. A second river, shallower than the first, ran along the right side of the road. The water was almost still in the flat sections, moving only where small stones interrupted it, clear. Pale at the bottom, she stopped. The scales had stilled completely, both sides perfectly level. She stood with the rod balanced on her forearm and looked at the water. There was a quality to complete stillness that she recognized. It was not the stillness before movement. It was the stillness of a thing held in its correct position. The scales were not about to tip. They were simply resting in the place where all active figures had been noted, and none were yet in motion. It did not last. It rarely did. But in the interval she stayed with it. The river sound was low and continuous. Somewhere above her on the hillside a bird called once and did not call again. The olive trees on the slope above were silver in the light, their leaves turned toward the pale sky. She looked at the measuring rod across her arm. The wood was old and smooth, worn down at the contact points from long carrying. She had carried it through the decline of the Silver Age. She had carried it through the wars of the heroes, through the particular pride of kings, through the accumulated confidence of men who had survived long enough to believe survival was permission. The chain of justice that had opened at Aulis was not finished. It would not finish with Agamemnon. She understood this without distress. Long chains were not failures of the system. They were simply long chains. She looked up from the rod. The road continued north. The valley ahead was quiet, the pale stone of a small settlement visible through the trees in the middle distance. Smoke from a single cooking fire rose straight up in the still air, unhurried, dispersing slowly at the top. She shifted the rod slightly and walked forward. The scales remained level at her side. The settlement was small. 3 or 4 buildings visible through the trees, low walls of pale stone, a roof of dark timber. A dog moved near the outer wall and stopped when it sensed her on the road. It did not bark. It simply stood and watched, head low, until she had passed. She did not slow. The scales stayed level at her side. The settlement held nothing that required her attention. The figures there were ordinary. Their lives moved within the natural range of things. No excess had accumulated. No correction was forming. She noted the absence of pressure and walked on. The road narrowed again past the settlement. Scrub oak pressed in from both sides, the leaves old bronze and dry, papery at the edges. The pale dust was fine and did not hold her footprints long. A light wind moved through the upper branches and then stopped. The air settled back to stillness. She thought of Aidos, not with longing. Not exactly, but with the particular recognition one reserves for those whose absence has become part of the familiar shape of things. Aidos had walked with her through the last of the Silver Age. They had gone together through the villages, past the market gatherings, along the roads between cities. Where Nemesis measured what lives had accumulated, Aidos read what lives still retained: shame, modesty, the quiet internal restraint that asked a person to consider what they were doing before the consequence arrived to answer it. Aidos was the early warning, Nemesis was the later one. For a long time they had been enough, but the Iron Age did not hold still. It deepened. The accumulations grew faster. The restraint grew thinner. Men took more than they needed and called it strength. Kings exceeded their proper measure and called it destiny. The gap between what Aidos offered and what people were willing to carry became too wide to bridge with presence alone. Nemesis remembered the last morning they had walked together. The light had been low and grey, a coastal road somewhere east of Ramnus. The sea had been flat. Aidos had not spoken for a long time. She had looked at the road and at the hills above the road, and at the particular quality of the sky over a world that was choosing not to listen. Then she had looked at Nemesis. What passed between them was not a conversation. It was a recognition, the same recognition that Nemesis carried with her, still, smooth and settled, worn down like the contact points on the measuring rod. Some departures were not decisions, they were consequences. Aidos had lifted from the road without ceremony, no formal announcement. No last words for the mortals below. She had simply risen, robed and still, into the grey air above the coastal hills, and the sky had received her without particular notice. Nemesis had stayed. She had not stayed because she disagreed. She had stayed because the work continued, whether or not the world acknowledged it. Aidos could withdraw. Her function required willingness in the one receiving it. You could not impose shame on a person who had decided shame was weakness. The gift could be refused. It often was. But the scales did not require acceptance to function. The account did not require the debtor's cooperation to accumulate. The correction that followed from an unresolved entry did not need to be invited. It found its own form, as she had noted before, through the choices already in motion. Through the people already positioned, through the causes already laid down years or decades earlier, the road began to rise. A low ridge ahead, the pale outline of it visible through a gap in the trees. The sky above the ridge was wide and clear, the light thin but steady, the kind of light that came with late season and did not promise warmth, she had thought. Sometimes, over the long centuries since that morning, about what the world looked like from above, what Aidos could see from wherever she had gone. Whether the view from that distance made the accumulation smaller, whether proportion looked different from a place that high. She did not spend long on the thought. It was not her information to have. What she had was the road, the scales, the rod, the work directly in front of her. The foretold path, as some had called it, as if the line of consequence were something drawn in advance and simply followed. She had never found that framing accurate. The line was not drawn before the choices. It was formed by them. Each entry made the next entry possible. Each accumulation set the conditions for what would eventually register on the scales. The path was not prophecy, it was arithmetic. Patient and inevitable and entirely indifferent to whether the person understood it, she reached the top of the ridge. The land below opened, a wider valley than the one behind her, longer and quieter, the light lying flat across dry grass and pale stone. A river wound through the floor of it, broader than the last, moving at a steady pace through the distance. Dark birds moved above it slowly, circling without urgency. She paused. The scales shifted. Barely. A small movement on the left side. Not a new entry. An old one adjusting. A figure whose account had been building for some time, making the small step that reduced the remaining distance between accumulation and consequence. She read it, noted the measure, let it settle. The world below her was quiet, late season and still. The grass moved slightly where the wind found it, and then stopped. The river moved on regardless. Nemesis looked at the valley for a long time without moving. The measuring rod lay across her forearm, old and smooth. The scales hung at her side, perfectly balanced now. The brief movement stilled again. The wide sky sat above the valley, pale and clear, holding no particular weather. Below her, unseen and distant in their separate houses and roads and lives, the accounts continued to form. Some were large, most were small. Most would resolve through ordinary consequence, through the natural pressure of a life exceeding its margin, without her direct presence, without any visible instrument reading the moment. She would still read them. That was not a choice she had made. It was what she was. She shifted the rod and started down the far side of the ridge into the wider valley. Toward the river, moving steadily through its old stone bed, the dark birds still circling above the water in the thin light of the late afternoon. She descended the ridge slowly. The path was narrower on this side, worn down to pale stone in places, the scrub oak giving way to low grass and scattered rock. The air was cooler in the valley's shadow. It smelled of dry earth and river water, the faint mineral cold of a waterway moving through old ground. The descent took some time. She did not hurry it. The valley floor received her without notice. The grass here was shorter than it had appeared from above, pressed flat in long, smooth patches where the wind had been working steadily over many seasons. The pale stone pushed through in places, broad and weathered, worn to softness by long exposure. Small yellow flowers grew in the cracks between the stones, very small, almost invisible, the kind that came late in the season when the warmth was already leaving. She noted them without pausing. Small things persisted in small margins. The river was closer now. She could hear it, a low, steady sound, not loud, the particular sound of water moving over a bed of flat stone without much urgency. It had the quality of something that had been making that sound for a very long time, and would continue making it long after the valley was otherwise quiet. She walked toward it. The dark birds above the water were herons. She could see them clearly now, 4 of them, moving in wide, unhurried circles over the shallows, their great wings barely shifting to hold the air beneath them. They were hunting, or they were simply moving, which for a heron amounts to the same thing. They paid no attention to her arrival. She reached the bank. The river was broad here, its surface calm and dark in the shadow of the far bank's willows. pale and quick where the light still caught the shallows. The bed was visible through the water in the shallows, flat grey stones, smooth and close together, with long thin weeds flowing in the current. A few reeds grew near her feet. They moved very slightly in the low wind that came off the water. She stood for a moment at the bank. The scales hung still at her side, no movement. No account pressing toward resolution in this immediate place. The valley was what it appeared to be. Old ground, a river doing its slow work. Birds above the water, watching for what the current might carry. Nemesis looked at the water for a long time. There was a temple not far from here, a day's walk perhaps, no more. The sanctuary at Ramnus stood on its low hill above the sea, the statue inside it still in its cool interior. The measuring rod laid across stone knees, the face carved from marble that had once belonged to a general who had brought it to Marathon expecting triumph. The marble had outlasted his expectation by several centuries. It was doing so still. She had not made the statue. No god makes their own image, but she recognized what the sculptor had understood. The figure was not threatening. It was not poised to strike or to punish. The hands were still. The rod lay across the lap without urgency. The expression was the expression of someone who had been reading an account for a very long time and was not yet finished. That was accurate enough. She did not need to visit the temple. Her presence was not the temple's purpose. The temple was for the people who needed a place to bring what they already knew, a place to acknowledge that the account existed. Sometimes acknowledgement was what made the difference. Sometimes it was too late for acknowledgement to matter. She read both. She noted both. One of the herons broke from its circle and descended to the shallows. It landed without sound, its legs folding beneath it like careful architecture. It stood very still in the water. Then it waited. She crossed the river at a shallow point downstream, stepping from stone to stone without difficulty. The cold water moved around the stones in thin, quick lines. On the far bank the willows were close together, their long branches trailing into the current, the leaves the pale yellow-green of very late season. She came through the willows and out onto a broader path that ran along the far bank. The path was old, the earth of it packed hard and pale, marked here and there with the prints of animals that had passed recently. A dog, something smaller, something that had stopped and turned back. The path led east and slightly north, toward the coast, toward the particular quality of air that came when the land began to give way to the sea, the way the light changed, the way sound travelled differently over water. She walked it as the afternoon continued its slow settling toward evening. The scales shifted once, very slightly, the right side dropping a small measure. She read it. An old entry, one she had noted many years before, had reached the point where what had been accumulated and what was owed were nearly equal, not quite balanced. Nearly. The remaining distance was small now. The account would close in its own time, through the mechanism already in place, through the ordinary pressure of a life whose margins had been spent. She let it settle and walked on. The light thinned further. The hills above the valley darkened from pale to grey, the shadows of the scrub oak extending across the slope in long, quiet lines. The sky overhead held its clear, pale colour, the day's last light moving very slowly toward the horizon. She was in no hurry. She would reach Ramnus in the morning, or the morning after. She would pass the temple on the low hill above the sea, the familiar stone cool in the early air, the statue inside it sitting in its permanent stillness. The measuring rod across the stone knees, the face carved from marble a general had brought to his own correction. The sea would be visible from the hill. Flat or moving, depending on what the wind was doing, it would sound the way it always sounded, the long, low sound of water against old stone, steady and without particular feeling. She would read what was on the scales. She would note the measure. She would continue. The heron was still standing in the shallows behind her, far back now across the water. A small, still shape in the last pale light, waiting with the patience of something that does not need to understand the river to stand inside it.